Hi guys, for week 3 of international organizations, we're going to look into ASEAN. Right now, for a lot of you, you may not have heard of ASEAN before, but that's a shame. This is an incredibly important organization. Okay, well, not incredibly important, but still pretty important. And why don't we start with that? Okay, why is ASEAN important? ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a grouping of 10 countries formed in 1967 through the Bangkok Declaration. At that time there were 4, and then it expanded to get all 10 within that region. Now, it's important because, well, firstly, from where we are, important to you, in Korea and Northeast Asia, it is the largest kind of group and bloc and the oldest one to us, right? And we, you, us, we, whatever, Korea has a lot of interactions with ASEAN. In fact, Korea is part of an ASEAN extension organization called ASEAN Plus 3. And the Plus 3 is Korea, Japan, and China, right? So this means incredibly huge trading and economic opportunity. There are, I don't know, I think like 500 million, 600 million people now in ASEAN. ASEAN Plus 3 is even larger than just ASEAN. But ASEAN also has incredible economic power and incredible economic potential, because it's an emerging economy, right? Like what they used to say about the BRICS. Before that, in the 90s, you had the Asian tigers. And the Asian tigers were Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. And to some extent, that's still, well, it dipped after the financial crisis, but is in a resurgence again now, or will be soon as the economy improves. Because, you got Indonesia, that's 300 plus million people, the largest Muslim country in the world, and growing very quickly. You've got Myanmar that was like depressed for a long time, but now it's opening up. So there's great potential there. In Thailand, Philippines, also relatively large economies. You get Vietnam that's growing. Of course, you got Malaysia. So there's all these countries there that can serve as a huge economic potential, trading partners, people to buy your stuff, people to sell stuff. To buy stuff from, and so on and so forth, right? But ASEAN is also important because it's a maturing bloc, right? So it's in the future, ASEAN is going to be called to do more things. In fact, they already are. In common disputes, like with China over territory, China has a few disputes with ASEAN nations over different kinds of territory. Similarly with any other country in that region, right? And ASEAN may be called to take a position on conflicts, not just with other powers outside the region, but within powers or issues within that region, right? So, say separatists in the Philippines or in Indonesia, the issue with Rohingyas or refugees, or how do you put it? People who don't have a home, right, in Myanmar. How does ASEAN deal with them? Okay, so those conflicts, if they exacerbate, if they grow, if they become a big issue, you need to have a kind of stabilizing, neutralizing power in that region in order to keep the peace. Otherwise, the peace will not be kept, right? The peace will go away, and then you'll get chaos and craziness. And of course, that chaos and craziness may eventually affect us. Okay? So ASEAN is really important and interesting in its own right to understand how this little, small kind of organization works compared to the large ones, the faraway ones, like the UN and the EU that we've discussed before. ASEAN is much closer to us, right? And that's the second reason why it's important and interesting. It will definitely have an impact on you and me and us. Okay, so let's try to understand the ASEAN story a little bit more. And with all these organizations, right, with international organizations, the same story with ASEAN. There is the role. What is ASEAN's role? What do they do? What do they think about? Debates about them internally. This is not international, this is internal. And debates about them externally. Okay? So, that's the, well, or you can go in that direction, and so on and so forth, right? So you'll get debates about what is the role of ASEAN, what ASEAN should be doing, what is their responsibilities, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these things you'll hear something called the non-intervention clause in the ASEAN Constitution or the ASEAN founding documents, okay? And I'll get to that soon. Then you have the things to do with ASEAN internally, okay? And this is also about how ASEAN should treat its members. So the debates about expansion. Should ASEAN include Australia? Should ASEAN include East Timor? Should the +3 members become permanent members of ASEAN? What about, other new states in that area? Changing their procedures. So actually this, the issue about intervention, should they remove the clause, right? So should they intervene? Should they change this clause internally? So that's an ASEAN issue. The issue that we're going to talk about at ASEAN Parliament is kind of more focused on ASEAN's internal role and whether or not that should change, but also as a question about their role. And then you'll have debates about externally. So how ASEAN impacts other things, right? So how should ASEAN deal with China? Okay, that's externally. Should ASEAN negotiate as a bloc to have a free trade agreement with other countries? That's ASEAN internal and an external perspective, right? How ASEAN deals with other people. So those are also, so that's going to be some portion of these debates, right? So always the little trinity of international organizations will help you understand how to approach the debates and where to talk about these issues. So let's look at the role. I think it's always important, especially with international organizations, to think about how those organizations were formed and look at the countries within the organization. And that's going to tell you about what the purpose of that organization is or was and what they're going to try to do. Okay, so I'm gonna draw a map now, but I promise you it's going to be very ugly. I've been practicing, but even then, failed. Okay, so we'll start with Malaysia, right? And then you have Thailand on the top. You have, I think that's Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, and then this is Indonesia. Indonesia is many islands, and then all across here. Half of this is also Malaysia. And then you have the Philippines, all here with one large island there. And then up here is China. And then, Korea and Japan and so on and so forth. I don't want to draw that because then you laugh at me even more. Then of course you have Australia over here, and then you have India over here, and then that's ASEAN, right? So this area is very rich in history. Okay, so there's ancient civilizations going back here, like 50,000, 100,000 years even, or maybe even before it formed actual civilizations. But, 20,000 years ago and so on, there were kingdoms, the Chinese kingdoms, the Indian kingdoms, and the local Siam, Thai kingdoms, and the Malay kingdoms, and so on and so forth, right? This area was also heavily colonized. The British had this portion here in the middle. The Dutch took Indonesia. The French took Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, so that became French Indochina and some parts of China. The British also took Myanmar. The Spanish took the Philippines. Okay, so heavily colonized because it was an important trading route. They traveled this way to go to China, right? The Straits of Malacca are still, and then Singapore over there, right? Straits of Malacca, Singapore, still very rich and busy trading route. The Spice Islands is where they got lots and lots of their spices, right? So it's been very strategic, trading area, very busy, very populous, very heavily, rich in history and so on and so forth, and rich in this colonial interference. So then came along, World War II, the 1940s, and when World War II ended, that's when colonialism also largely ended because all these colonial powers were fighting with each other, and then when they were fighting with each other, their people also started fighting against them. Well, not their people, but the people that they colonized. And they used them to fight their wars. And after that, a lot of them were like, hey, we don't really need you guys around anymore. And we kind of want our independence, and you're weak now, so we're going to take it. So in the 40s, 50s, all of these guys started getting, independence. You had, so Malaysia in 57. Thais were never really colonized, right? So they always somehow managed to maintain their independence. So they didn't have that. When the rest, obviously, so that I am accurate. Philippines in 1946. They declared independence much earlier, but that's when it was recognized. They also had the US colonizing them after the Spanish. Then you had Cambodia in 53, you had Singapore in 65, Indonesia in 49. So around, the same time, all of these guys got independence, right? The 40s and 50s, they all suddenly emerged from the yoke of colonialism and got with their newfound strength. But it wasn't like everything was super duper easy then. They still had issues. Because colonialism obviously created false boundaries, right? The peoples in this area shared a lot of similarity. And for a while they were like, why don't we all become one? Maybe we can all become one. But no, we already have differences, and should we become one? The colonial powers were still interfering, as they actually still do, and trying to keep them apart or push them together and doing all those kinds of different things. And then the Cold War was happening, right? That's when you had the wars in Vietnam. That's when, around this time, there was the Korean invasion and heavy fighting in Korea. And you had proxy wars all around the world, right? For many, many years to come. So these ASEAN countries, these Asian countries, specifically Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, that's where kind of how it started, didn't like this notion of interference. They were like, everybody's trying to pull us one way or another. So maybe the best thing we can do is we can stick together, right? So let's do that. Let's be buddies. Let's stick together. And that's what they decided, right? So they formed the Association of Southeast Asia with Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand in 1961. And then that became ASEAN with the inclusion of Singapore and Indonesia, so these five guys, in 1967. They did the Bangkok Declaration, right? You always have these declarations about different places. It's either places or people, but with these international organizations, largely places, right? So if you pick a capital, there's always one. There's the Jakarta Declaration, there's the Kuala Lumpur one, there's Manila, there's Bangkok. The first one was in Bangkok, and this was the founding declaration that created ASEAN. Now, long story short, the important thing you need to remember and realize is this was formed during a time when these countries were desperately trying to maintain some kind of independence. They were fledgling, they were really, really new. They didn't have an established government or political process or, even political parties yet at that point, right? It varies, but it would have been 10, 15, 20 years, the oldest, and some of the others, right? And so they were very, very wary of interference. They were very wary of another country, another organization telling them what to do, right? Because they've been living under colonialism for like hundreds of years. And the last thing they wanted was to create another organization that would go in and tell other people what to do. And that's why this non-intervention thing is really, really important and became a huge part of ASEAN. Okay? So this is how you can see a lot of similarities here with the European Union. That the countries share similarities and yet have distinct differences. That they have a geographical, closeness, and that is a huge reason to form an organization because they share borders, security issues, the environmental issues, right? With forest fires in one country creates haze which affects all the other countries. A terrorist insurgency or a war in one country will affect the other countries. So just like the EU, all of those things are really important. But their mindset when they formed was slightly different from the EU. The EU is very comfortable with their own sovereignty. They've never been colonized. Well, some of the newer EU countries have, but the older ones, no. Not in the way that these guys were, right? And so they wanted to build stronger ties with an eventual political union. ASEAN didn't really think about having an eventual political union. When EU and when all these some other international organizations began to get closer and closer, then members of ASEAN were like, maybe it's time for us to take our organization to the next level, okay? So keep this context in mind when you discuss ASEAN. the context of how they were formed, and the context of those individual nations. Because that's the other thing now that's interesting. There's always, whenever we discuss international organizations, you need to talk about the now. So it's the then and the now, right? So something happened then that still influences this organization, that sets the mindset and the frame of mind and the paradigm and thinking. But something's happening now that may change that may influence that may guide that, or that may make it more relevant, and so on and so forth, right? So in the then, this was all the stuff that was set up in the then. In the now, you've come 50 years later, the populations have increased so much, the governments are fairly stable. It used to be a bunch of dictators in most of these countries, right? You had like Sukarno here, you had Marcos and Ramos, and you had Mahathir for 22 over years in Malaysia. And these were people who really valued their independence, who didn't want to criticize in other countries human rights violations because they were doing it too. So it made it kind of difficult to tell this other person not to arrest journalists or clamp down on opposition party members because, they were kind of doing it too. But most of those things are, well, not all changed, but changing now, right? You still have Myanmar, coming out somewhat, opening up a lot. You still have quite a lot of suppression in Vietnam, Cambodia, but still changing. Indonesia has gone through an amazing revolution, so has the Philippines, and the amount of freedom, press, and democracy and exposure these countries now have to the rest of the world is incredible and it's immense, right? So what is changed now that could argue or that could lend some credence to, some persuasion to this new form of thinking, right? So that's how you need to approach this debate. And I think pretty much every debate about kind of social change, even if it's, whether you're talking about one country, we're talking about what was then, what's now, international organizations, a little bit more complex, what was then and what was now, right? So that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions? Guess not then. So, time to move on. The motion that we will be looking at in this debate will be about forming parliaments. Oh, this is really hard to get rid of. Whether to form an ASEAN parliament. Right. You should watch the debates about political union, because I think that's quite a similar one. We can see this. Oh, you can't. I'll write it again. Okay, I hope you can see this now. Otherwise, just think about it. Okay, so this is a debate that has been going on for a long time. Actually, the finals of my first Asian debating championships was about this, right? Back in 2001, I think it was the first one that I was competing in. Whether or not ASEAN should form a parliament. And it's a very complex debate, right? Because parliaments are huge. And most people don't understand parliaments and how exactly they function, even in your own country or in one country, let alone if it's going to take in many different countries, okay? But again, trying to simplify, right? So if you look at the different countries in ASEAN, like different states in a country, then the parliament should function just like that, in a very kind of federalist model, right? So if you're looking at, say, America, each state is quite independent and very proud of its sovereignty, and yet they give up a little bit of sovereignty to form one large state because there are benefits, because you can pool your resources, because you can have greater amounts of protection, because you have a lot more trade and all of those different things, right? So that's what parliaments do. Parliaments are a common form of governance that keep together all the different members, and the members try to maintain some independence and individuality. Now, of course, you're not going to form a single country here, right? I think that's too much to ask, right? You want more unity, but not that much unity that you form a country, because I think that's going to be a little bit crazy, right? That's never going to happen, not going to fly. But this debate is about more togetherness versus less togetherness, right? So on the togetherness, let's say unity index, on the government side, you want a lot of unity. On the opposition side, you want less, right? Or you want whatever is in the status quo. You contrast the pros and cons of these things. Here will be more people coming together, more cooperation, more stability, deal with problems better, and so on and so forth. You talk about the benefits of being more integrated. Okay, that could be a better word than unity. The benefits of higher integration, right? So usually that's going to be more efficiency, that's going to be better outcomes, that's going to be more stability. Those are all benefits of more integration, assuming the parliament works, right? So you take a slightly more optimistic, idealistic kind of view on the government side. On the opposition side, you're a little bit more negative. You don't have that much great faith in parliaments. You think sometimes it doesn't work, and if people are not ready for this, and they will clash and they will create problems, right? Things are going to fall apart. They're going to argue most of the time, and that's going to lead to disintegration, not more integration. And you like the current sovereign but cooperative model, okay? So you just pretty much have to defend the status quo in op, right? So let's get into, let's be a little bit more specific here. You're going to need a bit of a model here on Gov. And this is going to get complex a little bit. My advice to you is not to worry that much about the model though. Like, make the debate still about the principle, okay? And this is how you should focus. Anything. Remember that this is an incredibly complex issue. You've got 10 countries, you're trying to propose building a parliament for them. You're not going to get it absolutely right. So don't overcomplicate the model. Keep the debate focused on the principles, that is greater unity, but propose some kind of simple model that helps people understand each other, right? Or give people a framework for the debate. It's always a good idea to do a kind of comparison. So pick a parliamentary model that you are familiar with and then suggest that, right? Now the tricky thing about models for this debate or for this country, or for this group of countries, is that the countries are very different. Culturally different to some extent, but size and economy scale different, right? You have Singapore, high GDP per capita, but only 4 plus, 6 plus maybe million people. Then you have Indonesia with growing economy and GDP per capita, but nowhere near Singapore's, and like 300 million people, right? So how many votes do you give both of these countries? And if you base it on population, Indonesia is going to be the most powerful country. If you base it on economy, Singapore is going to be the most powerful country. So how do you pick and choose? A good approach maybe is to have 2 houses in your parliament, or to have a double voting system, right? A double voting system is whenever you want to approve something, you need to get the most number of votes, as in if the votes are proportional to the people, and you need to get more number of countries to agree on something. Okay, so just in case people, if that's easy for you to understand, you can propose that. Or you talk about a 2-house system, which is essentially kind of like the same thing, right? So you will have like an upper house maybe, and a lower house, and one of these houses, maybe the lower house, is based on population. So you get representatives, like proportional, right? 2 representatives for every, 10 million people, or they can negotiate and decide something. So Singapore will get 5, and Indonesia will get 20, or something, and then they'll work it out. And then the other one, which is fixed, so it's like 2 per country. Okay, so this is kind of like the US, how the US House of Representatives and the Senate works. In the House of Representatives, you have all the different, the seats decided based on proportional representation, and in the upper house you have the senators, there's 2 per state. And for something to pass, both of them need to agree, right? So if only one of them agrees, nothing happens. Okay? So if you're familiar with this and it sounds something that's simple, then just run it, right? Otherwise, say that we'll just have one house and they will decide the seats based on their negotiations, okay? And they will choose a number that reflects both the size of their economy and the size of their population. Cool, good, done. Interesting stuff then, let's get on to the arguments. So, obviously the big thing you're going to run with is the strength and how the country is going to come together, okay? But try to be as detailed as possible. Don't just say they will be stronger, they'll be more together. Talk about the benefits of having a parliament. What do parliaments do? Parliaments pass laws. So you're going to say it's going to be more effective legislation. Right? More effective legislation making or policy making, right? So they'll create better laws, and not only create better laws, they will resolve conflicts. Better laws resolve conflicts, right? So, and not just conflicts as in, countries can't agree with each other, conflicts as in like fighting in countries, but conflicts in those laws. Like how do we form better legislation? Now you have legislatures elected at an ASEAN level, right? So these guys also have a specific mandate. Because in the current model, when I go to an ASEAN meeting, I'm representing my country's interests, right? I'm a Malaysian representative, you're a Singaporean representative. So you tend to look very much to your country, not look at the whole region as a whole. Yeah, you want to build stuff for the region, but you're still looking at your country. But when I get elected now to an ASEAN parliament, then my focus is on ASEAN level stuff. So when I campaign to people, when I make my agenda, my manifesto, all of those things, I'm thinking, what's the best for ASEAN? Okay? So I have a specific mandate to push forward things for ASEAN. So all of these things you argue will create much better legislation. It's going to resolve conflicts that the countries have among each other from the legislation wise and really push forward integration, which will then create all these amazing benefits, right? Economic benefits, environmental benefits, solve problems, security benefits, and then if you can pick out some issues here, like, AFTA is failing. AFTA is a free trade agreement that ASEAN, free trade area that ASEAN is trying to create, but haven't managed to so far. It would help deal with piracy problems that are, that's happening. It would create peace, blah, 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 blah. So on all of this wonderful, amazing things that would happen from this. And there's a bulk of argumentation here that you can split into a few different levels, okay? Good. The second thing you think about parliaments, what you're going to get in a parliament, you get elections, and you get parliaments about democracy. I'll argue democracy, right? And I think that's a thing that you can get, a benefit that you'll get from having this parliament too. It's true that there isn't a full-fledged democracy in some of these countries, like in Vietnam, like in Myanmar, but they do have elections, are moving towards more and more freer, more and more open elections, and you can say this is a good time for ASEAN to take the lead, right? Because now you'll have more elections, you'll have ASEAN-level elections, and maybe ASEAN-level elections could be a starting point for countries to become even more democratic, because these elections could be viewed as less threatening, right? By Myanmar, yeah, let's have an ASEAN level election because I don't really change my power, but you can send someone to sit at an ASEAN level parliament and try to do some things, right? So it's going to increase democracy in the region, create more awareness about ASEAN level issues, but also just about democracy. And it will lead for this direct participation of people in shaping ASEAN. Okay? And from here you can also create some interesting ideas about how people view themselves as members of ASEAN, as part of a larger community, right? And from there extend it to talk about how this would create a greater sense of togetherness, a greater sense of belonging to a wider geographical region and not just a very close state-like thinking mentality. The same way different states within a country can bond. You still feel pride of your state, right? But you will still feel a belonging to that country. And that's what a parliament could create a sense of union, a sense of one. Okay? So that's the line of argumentation from the Gov. Well, a little bit idealistic, but hey, if you're not going to argue for ideals, then what's the point, right? Because the people who have bad news can just say, this is bad news, the reality is bad news. We need sometimes some hope, and you have to bring that hope. But not an opposition. On opposition, you don't have to sound like the most upset and pessimistic person in the world, but you try to sound realistic and you try to sound positive about the status quo, because that's what the Gov is going to do. The Gov is going to be negative about the status quo. They're going to say the status quo is kind of broken. ASEAN can't really work it out. They're not really doing many things together. We need to be more, in Gov, the status quo is broken, so we need to change things and be more together. On op, you'll say the status quo is all right. We move slowly, but we think we should move slowly. Like, it's good to move slowly. We don't want to rush and do things because we're not one country. We value our sovereignty very much, right? Our independence. We had to work very hard to get our independence, and we've had it for only like 40, 50 years for most of us. So we don't want to be too quick to give up any of our independence, okay? It's very, very important. This stuff is precious. But we think the status quo is okay. Status quo is good, right? Keep working on the status quo, keep improving this stuff. All that stuff's going to work out, right? So we like to have ASEAN together, but too much of this is going to create a problem, all right? So specifically, you can run some of these arguments. You can talk about how it will create more harm. Okay, so it's going to increase the harm, it'll create problems. So parliaments create conflict. Any of you has watched the Korean parliament sitting, Taiwanese parliament sitting, many other parliamentary sittings, will realize that it's not always the most peaceful place. So why bring more conflict? Because now it's just going to highlight disagreements. We think it's better if these countries sort out things among their own, get a mandate of their people. It's also more powerful, right? We don't need to have more and more of these elections that don't really add to that much more value. And it creates, so it'll also have too much pressure, okay, on the country. So now you have a parliament trying to create these laws, and then more and more elections, and people will just, will feel like they're being imposed on, right? And this may actually push ASEAN apart, because if the parliament, say, decides something that Myanmar doesn't want to do, that Indonesia doesn't want to do, they're like, who are you to tell us these things? And then maybe we're going to leave ASEAN. So this could threaten the future of ASEAN, right? So then it will be a bad thing for ASEAN, right? So talk about then the role of ASEAN and why ASEAN's unique. Okay, so ASEAN needs to maintain a balance. Okay, this could be your sovereignty kind of idea coming in there as well. That a balance between recognizing the independence of these nations, developing their independence, because they're still quite young democracies, and collaborating and working together, right? And that balance we think is the best, because that balance doesn't lead to countries feeling insecure and worrying about other countries, trying to do things to them, right? That balance means that they can keep building their country and they can collaborate better. If I don't worry or fear that ASEAN is going to criticize me, then I'm more willing to work together with ASEAN, right? ASEAN is not trying to take my power, so I can be more comfortable, more open with them. If I'm worried that this parliament is trying to take something from me, then I'm going to hold back. I'm not going to share things with you because I'm going to be really worried about you, okay? So, then the other argument is talking about how the status quo works, and then that's actually not so bad, right? And that's also actually true. Like, a lot of people, you can criticize organizations for not doing things, but you also forget many of the things that they actually do. And you don't want them to do too many things, because if they do too many things, it's hard to change these things, right? The impact of an ASEAN level law is pretty huge, because it impacts all of the different nations. So I think there's something to be said about arguing how ASEAN is working. That is the definition of them working. That the standard of success that you place upon ASEAN isn't like, looking at them like a small company. That they should have a meeting every other week, and then they should be generating new things and creating new stuff and all of these other things, right? You need to chill a little bit and relax. Focus on countries doing their own stuff. The change is happening slowly, Why do we need to panic? Why do we need to rush? Okay, so that's the view that you take from opposition. Status quo is working fine. Let's keep it as it is. Too much integration could break ASEAN apart because these countries are still young. These countries are different and diverse, and these countries are developing their independence and their sense of sovereignty. So keep the integration as it is. So what if AFTA takes longer? Many other free trade agreements are also taking time, right? The EU is considering dismantling the euro. NAFTA is not really doing so well anyway, or failing and pretty much being scrapped. So why all this pressure on ASEAN? And the pressure is going to be bad. The pressure is going to break ASEAN apart even further, because now Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and Indonesia, all these countries maybe will feel very, very insecure that they're being challenged on an ASEAN level, and then may leave or may be less cooperative on other areas. Okay, so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. It's an important debate. It's an important debate because it's one that does affect you. If this is an organization or a region that fails, Korea is going to be affected one way or another. But it also affects you because they're people, because this is the world, and we are debaters, and this is what we do. We debate things on the other side of the world because someone needs to, because you need to, because you will. Thank you very much.